The night had fallen over the small suburban neighborhood, and inside the cramped two-story house, the sounds of raised voices had become so common that no one on the street even bothered to turn their heads anymore. But for Rosalia, a 68-year-old grandmother who had once believed that her retirement years would be filled with warmth and the laughter of her family, every word hurled at her by the people she loved cut more deeply than the winter wind that leaked through the cracked window frame above her narrow bed. She had worked her entire life in a factory, saved every penny she could, stretched her wages so her daughter could go to college, so her grandson could have school supplies and new clothes, so the family would never know the kind of poverty she herself had been raised in. And yet now, when she was frail and tired, when her knees ached every morning and her hands shook when she tried to make tea, she was treated not as the pillar of the household, but as an inconvenient burden, someone to be mocked, ignored, and eventually discarded. That evening she had tried to help in the kitchen, peeling potatoes slowly, her swollen fingers fumbling with the knife. But her daughter had sighed loudly, snatched the peeler away, and told her to go sit down because she was too slow, too clumsy, making a mess of everything. And so Rosalia had gone quietly to the living room, lowering herself into the corner of the old couch, her heart heavy, but her mouth closed because she knew that if she spoke up, if she dared to say that she still wanted to feel useful, she would be accused of complaining again. The television blared some meaningless show. Her grandson sprawled on the floor with his phone glowing in his hands. And for a while she tried to believe that the hostility of the day would fade, that perhaps they would remember she was the one who had paid the bills for years when her daughter had been out of work, that they might look at her and see not just an old woman, but their own blood. But then, out of nowhere, the boy's voice rose, sharp and venomous, startling in its cruelty. "You're nothing to us," he shouted, his teenage face twisted with contempt that did not belong to a child, but to someone who had learned well from the adults around him. The words ricocheted through the room and pierced her like shards of glass, and for a long moment she could not breathe, her chest tightening as if the walls themselves had closed in. Her daughter did not correct him, did not scold him, did not even flinch. Instead, she smirked and kept stirring the pot in the kitchen, as if the insult were simply the truth spoken aloud. And Rosalia realized with a sickening clarity that she was truly alone in this house. She lowered her eyes to hide the tears that burned. But behind her grief, there was something else rising, something she had buried for too many years. A slow, steady anger. She reached for the cheap plastic phone in the pocket of her cardigan, the one they laughed at her for keeping because it was old and scratched. But what they did not know was that the little voice recorder built into it was already running. She had pressed the button earlier, almost without thinking, when the tension began to boil, as if her instincts had whispered that tonight the truth would reveal itself. Now the proof was captured. Her grandson's scream, the silence of her daughter's tacit approval, the ugliness of a household that pretended to outsiders that they were a normal, happy family. Rosalia sat very still, her heart pounding, while inside her head the plan began to form, fragile but undeniable. She had been humiliated for years in small ways that accumulated until they formed a mountain crushing her spirit. Being denied her own medication because her daughter claimed it was too expensive for pills that don't even work. Being forbidden to adjust the thermostat because the bills are already sky high. Being told to eat leftovers that had gone dry while fresh meals were reserved for the younger ones. She had endured insults whispered in the dark, laughter behind her back, the sting of being treated as though she were already half gone from this world. And all the while she told herself that family was family, that blood would protect her, that to raise her voice would only drive them further away, Yet here she was, after decades of sacrifice, sitting on a sagging couch in a house bought partly with her savings, being told by her own flesh and blood that she was nothing. The sound of those words kept echoing inside her, louder than the television, louder than the clatter of pots in the kitchen, louder than her own thoughts. For a moment, she imagined herself screaming back, telling them everything she had held in, listing every sacrifice, every night shift, every meal skipped so they could eat, every debt she had paid for them, every pair of shoes she had gone without, so. The boy could have new sneakers, but she did not scream. Instead, she tightened her fingers around the phone in her pocket, feeling the small ridges of the recorder button, reminding herself that silence could sometimes be more powerful than shouting. Outside, the street was quiet, a cold wind brushing against the thin curtains, and Rosalia thought of the neighbours, who perhaps suspected something was wrong but never intervened, of the pharmacist who had frowned when she stopped buying her prescribed medication months ago, of the look in the postman's eyes when he handed her letters that were always bank statements she was not allowed to open. The world went on, indifferent, but she was gathering her evidence piece by piece, even if no one yet realized it. Tonight's recording would be another stone in the foundation of her case, another weapon in a battle she had been too afraid to fight until now. When the boy stormed upstairs, slamming his door, and her daughter muttered under her breath about old people being impossible, Rosalia leaned back and closed her eyes, letting the humiliation wash over her, but refusing to drown in it. She thought of the office she had passed by last week, the one with the sign that read Child Services, and she remembered how she had almost walked in, almost told the woman at the desk about the shouting and the threats, about the bruises of words that left no visible mark but tore at her soul. She had hesitated then, telling herself she needed more proof, but now proof existed, living inside the tiny memory chip of her phone. As the minutes dragged on and the household returned to its uneasy rhythm, Rosalia felt something shift inside her. She was still scared, still trembling from the weight of those cruel words, but beneath the fear was a clarity she had not known in years. They thought she was powerless, that her voice would never be heard, that age had made her invisible, but she knew better now. She would send the recording to those who could not ignore it, to officials bound by duty to protect. And once she took that step, there would be no going back. For the first time in a long time, she felt the spark of control, fragile but real, and she held onto it like a lifeline. The night stretched ahead, heavy with silence, but inside that silence, a seed had been planted. Rosalia, the woman dismissed as nothing, had begun to imagine the moment when her truth would echo louder than her grandson's insult, when those who mocked her would be forced to listen, when the dignity they had tried to strip away would be restored, in a place they could not touch. And though her body ached and her heart still quivered, she whispered to herself, almost imperceptibly, that she was far from nothing, and the world would soon see it too. The following morning did not begin with any sign of peace. Rosalia woke early, as she always did, her joints stiff from a night spent on the old couch, rather than in her small bedroom upstairs, where the window let in too much cold. But before she had even stood up fully, she could hear her daughter's sharp voice drifting from the kitchen, complaining about bills, complaining about responsibility, complaining about how unfair it was to carry everything alone. Rosalia, who had carried everything for decades, said nothing as she moved slowly toward the stove, intending to boil water for tea. She reached for her small ceramic mug, the one she had used for years, chipped along the rim but still serviceable, and set it carefully on the counter. But her daughter pushed it aside to make space for her own coffee cup, muttering that the kitchen was too cramped with old junk lying around. The insult was small, almost trivial, yet it landed with the weight of accumulated years of contempt, and Rosalia simply lowered her eyes, retreating to the corner as she stirred her tea with trembling fingers. It was then, while she sat quietly at the small table, that the conversation she was never supposed to hear began. Her grandson, still in his pajamas, came into the kitchen yawning, his phone in his hand, his voice casual and indifferent. "When are we going to finally do it?" he asked, as if they were talking about rearranging furniture. Rosalia felt her stomach tighten, her ears straining. Though she dared not turn her head too obviously, her daughter answered in a low but steady voice, a tone that carried both annoyance and certainty. "Soon. We can't keep her here much longer. It's already hard enough paying for everything, and the house would be easier to refinance without her in the way." Rosalia felt the blood drain from her face, her body turning cold despite the hot tea between her palms. She had suspected for months that something was being planned, but to hear it spoken aloud, without shame, by her own child, was like being pierced through the heart. The grandson scoffed and leaned against the counter. "She's useless anyway. She doesn't even pay for herself. What's the point of keeping her here? We could put her in someplace, sign the papers, and be done with it." His words were spoken with the callousness of someone who had never known sacrifice, never understood the value of years given selflessly to others. Rosalia's daughter nodded grimly, lowering her voice further. "I'll make the calls. There are facilities that take people like her, and once she's out of here, the house will finally be ours. It's not like anyone will listen to her if she protests. She forgets things. She rambles. She looks confused most of the time. No one will believe her. And if she causes trouble, we can say she's not well, that she's showing signs of dementia. That's enough for them to take her off our hands." The calm certainty with which her daughter laid out the plan made Rosalia's hands shake, her tea spilling slightly onto the table. She wanted to cry out, to demand how they could speak of her this way, but she held herself still, remembering the phone tucked deep in the pocket of her cardigan. She had left the recorder running the night before after the outburst in the living room, and now, with a mixture of dread and grim satisfaction, she realized that it was still running, capturing every poisonous word that poured from their mouths. The proof was being collected not by chance, but by the cruel honesty of people who no longer felt the need to hide their intentions. They believed she was powerless, and in their arrogance they revealed everything, step by step, like conspirators who thought themselves immune to consequence. Rosalia excused herself quietly, pretending she needed to fetch something from the hallway, and once she was alone, she clutched the phone to her chest, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might give her away. For a moment she leaned against the wall, trying to breathe, the weight of betrayal almost too much to bear. The thought of being thrown into an institution, left to fade away among strangers, abandoned by the very people she had raised, filled her with a terror deeper than anything she had known in her life. The decision rose in her mind like a flare in the dark. She would send it to Child Services, the agency whose office she had passed so many times, the place where she had always hesitated to go. She would not hesitate any longer. Her hands shook as she navigated the phone's small screen, the letters blurred slightly by the wetness in her eyes. But eventually she composed a message, short and direct, attaching the audio file that had captured both the boy's cruel insult and the plan of her daughter to discard her. She typed her name and address, added a plea for someone to listen, and pressed send. The moment the message was gone, her knees nearly buckled, as if she had leapt off a cliff, but she forced herself to stand straight. A strange calm settled over her chest, a calm born not from peace, but from necessity. She had acted. The first stone had been thrown, and whatever came next, there was no returning to silence. Back in the kitchen, the conversation continued as if nothing had happened. Her grandson laughed at something on his phone, showing his mother a meme, and the two of them spoke about grocery shopping and errands, as though they had not just conspired to erase her from their lives. Rosalia returned to her seat, her face carefully blank, her heart still hammering. They looked at her with that casual indifference they had perfected, not realizing that the balance of power had begun to shift, that their cruelty had finally crossed a line from which there would be consequences. She sipped her tea slowly, tasting the bitterness of both the leaves and the truth she now carried. The day unfolded with an almost unbearable slowness. Every sound of a passing car made her tense, wondering if officials would arrive immediately. Every ring of the phone jolted her nerves, but hours passed without response. She began to doubt, to fear that her message had disappeared into a void, that no one would care, that bureaucracy would swallow her plea as surely as her family had swallowed her dignity. The doubt gnawed at her until, late in the afternoon, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unfamiliar number, and her breath caught as she opened it. The message was brief but powerful. "We received your report. An officer will visit within days. Please keep yourself safe." She read the words again and again, her hands trembling. Someone had heard her. Someone beyond these walls now knew what was happening. The secret was no longer confined to her lonely chest. It was documented, acknowledged, waiting for follow-up. Her daughter and grandson went about their evening as usual, oblivious, laughing at a television show while she sat in the corner with her phone pressed against her palm like a sacred talisman. For the first time in years, she did not feel entirely alone. The fear remained, but alongside it was a fragile hope, and that hope gave her strength. That night, as the house grew quiet and she lay once again on the couch, Rosalia stared at the ceiling and let her mind wander to what might come. She imagined strangers arriving with badges, asking questions, writing down her words, listening to the recordings she had kept. She imagined her daughter's face when confronted with her own voice played back in an official's presence, the arrogance crumbling, the lies exposed. She imagined her grandson's bravado faltering when he realized that the words he had shouted in cruelty had become evidence in a case larger than himself. These visions gave her a strange comfort, though she knew the road ahead would not be simple. She would have to withstand their anger, their attempts to twist the story, their inevitable retaliation. But she would not be silent again. The catalyst had been set in motion. The recording had left her hands and entered the realm of authority, and in that act, Rosalia had taken back a fragment of the power stolen from her. Whatever her family planned, however they schemed, the truth now had a voice, and it was her voice, trembling but unbroken. The visit did not begin with sirens or dramatic knocks. Rather, it started with the soft, almost apologetic chime of the doorbell late the next morning, a sound so ordinary that Rosalia's heart stumbled in her chest because nothing about what was about to happen felt ordinary at all. And for several suspended seconds, no one in the house moved. The television murmuring in the living room, the kettle humming on the stove, the day pretending to be normal until her daughter glanced toward the entryway with a flash of irritation and annoyance that quickly arranged itself into a careful mask. And then the boy, still half barefoot and carrying his phone like a shield, said he would check, his voice neutral, as if expecting a package rather. Then consequence. When he opened the door and stepped back, Rosalia could see, past his shoulder, the two figures framed by the grey daylight. A woman in a navy cardigan with a laminated badge clipped to the neckline, and a man in a plain jacket who looked too young to be a father and too old to be a student, both of them steady and soft-spoken in the way that people learn to be when they carry authority into volatile homes. And the woman said a name, her tone level, asking to confirm the address, asking if the homeowner could speak for a few minutes, asking in that rehearsed cadence which is deliberately calming and impossible to ignore. Her daughter answered with an upbeat brightness that belonged to a different house, a different version of their lives, a gloss laid on so thick it almost gleamed, saying yes, of course. Please come in. The place is a mess, but we are delighted to cooperate with anything the city needs. And she gestured toward the living room, as if ushering guests to a holiday brunch, rather than investigators to a whispered battlefield, while the boy lowered himself onto the arm of the couch and half hid, behind the screen in his hands, his eyes darting with a nervy, suspicious hunger that tried to read the visitors' faces. And in the doorway, Rosalia stood very still, her fingers hovering at the edge of her cardigan pocket where the little phone rested like a faintly beating heart, and she whispered to herself to breathe, to keep breathing, to let the scene unfold without giving away either her terror or her resolve. The woman introduced herself as an intake specialist from Child Services and introduced the man as a community liaison who sometimes joins first visits in cases that involve minors. And at the word minors, the boy grew stiff, his eyes flickering, though he tried at once to curve his mouth into a half-smile, a mimicry of politeness, which on his face looked like a flinch. Rosalia's daughter launched immediately into a narrative that had clearly been practiced in front of bathroom mirrors and steering wheels. A tale of a loving household strained by an elderly parent who, while beloved and cared for, had been declining, in ways that were difficult to manage, of forgetfulness that interrupted the routines of the home, of unfounded accusations that were the unfortunate consequence of confusion, of a sweet boy who, pressured by schoolwork and the turbulence of adolescence, sometimes spoke out of turn, but never meant harm. And as she spoke, she drifted toward the kitchen, where she had years of practice staying busy to make her lies feel like incidental truths, pouring coffee into clean mugs, setting out a plate of store-bought cookies, creating in gesture what she claimed in words, which was the image of a house in good faith, a family under stress but fundamentally sound. And in that dance, Rosalia had the eerie sensation of watching her own erasure, being laminated into something official. The intake specialist listened without taking many notes, her eyes steady on the speaker's face in that purposeful way that suggests the mind is collecting not just words, but fractures in tone, strange emphases, inconsistencies between the claimed tenderness and the dismissive roll of a shoulder. And when the daughter paused to lift the coffee pot and ask if anyone took sugar, the specialist turned gently toward Rosalia and asked if they might speak alone for a moment, because it was important, always to hear from every member of the household. And at that invitation, the boy muttered something under his breath that sounded like a scoff disguised as a cough, while his mother smiled very brightly and said, "Of course, anything you need." They went to Rosalia's small room, a space that smelled faintly of lavender and cold air, with a narrow bed pressed against the wall and a small dresser whose drawers stuck in the tracks. And there, with the door half closed but not latched, because nothing in this house was ever fully private, the specialist sat on the edge of the chair by the window and lowered her voice to a register that felt almost like a prayer, saying that she had received some materials the previous day and that the department took such things seriously, and that while this was a first visit and not yet a legal proceeding, she wanted to understand the context, the history, the lived reality behind the brief report. Rosalia felt the years crowding in on her tongue, a lifetime of swallowing bitterness and rinsing her mouth with silence, and she was afraid that when she spoke, the words would either shatter or spill uncontrollably, so she forced her breath to slow, and she began to narrate the quieter humiliations as well as the sharp cruelties, the way her medication had been rationed and sometimes hidden in the name of saving money, while new sneakers arrived at the door for a boy who never said thank you. The way she was forbidden to touch the thermostat, even when winter pressed its fingers through the cracked window. The way meals were portioned in a kitchen where her body was present. But her appetite was treated as problematic, the way the house that. She spoke of the night before, the insult hurled like a stone and left intentionally unrebuked by the mother who should have caught it as it flew. And she spoke of the morning's conversation in which a plan had been folded and refolded until it lay, flat and plausible. A plan to place her somewhere else and to explain away her protests as the mutterings of a disoriented mind. And as she spoke, she held the phone in both hands as if it were fragile despite its cheap plastic. And at the right moment, she unlocked it and played the recording, not with triumph, but with a sorrow so heavy it seemed to bend the air in the room. The intake specialist did not flinch at the first ugliness of the boy's voice, did not shift when the daughter's tone grew clinical and cool as she discussed logistics of discarding a parent. Instead, she sat still, eyes on the far wall in the habit of professionals trained to listen intently while allowing victims to hold the center of the space. And when the audio ended, she let several breaths pass in silence before she spoke, saying that this was, indeed, a serious situation, and that their office would need to follow certain steps to corroborate what they had heard, because due process and careful documentation were the backbone of any protection that would last longer than a day. The first escalation began not with dramatic declarations, but with forms and protocols, with the specialist asking if Rosalia could provide any additional records that might illuminate the pattern, and Rosalia, who had half feared she would sound like a hysteric inventing grievances, felt a quiet swell of vindication as she opened the drawer where she kept a folder of bank statements and photocopies and scribbled notes, where she had tracked withdrawals she had never authorized and transactions she had been told not to question, where she had tucked a paper from the pharmacy showing that certain prescriptions had not been refilled for months, despite the doctor's instructions. And as she laid these items on the bedspread, she apologized for the disorder, and the specialist shook her head and said no apology was needed, that the paper itself often told a story that people tried very hard to bury. The young liaison joined them at the doorway, his voice careful as he asked if Rosalia would be comfortable signing a simple release that would allow them to speak with her doctor and the pharmacy, to cross-check what she had shared, to build a timeline that would be difficult to dismantle with a prettified narrative later, and she agreed, the pen feeling heavy in her hand but steady. And when she finished, the liaison thanked her with a sincerity that made her eyes sting. In the living room, the daughter had arranged cups and saucers and a plate of cookies alongside a stack of mail that, by coincidence or design, included a glossy brochure for an assisted living facility. And when the officials returned, she launched, again, into coaxing sentences that tried to install doubt in their minds regarding anything her mother might have said, emphasizing that the old woman sometimes dramatized, sometimes misheard, sometimes invented slights because she was sensitive, and the specialist, with the implacable politeness of those who know that time can be an ally, did not contradict her, merely asked to schedule a follow-up and to conduct brief separate interviews at school, and, if needed, with neighbours who might have observed patterns. And at the word neighbours, the daughter faltered for a fraction of a second, a hairline crack in a porcelain mask, and then recovered, saying, "Yes, of course. Talk to whomever you wish. We have nothing to hide." The boy sat up straighter during this exchange, And at one point he interjected to say that everything was being blown out of proportion because he had only been annoyed about chores and had said something he didn't mean, and that it was cruel to put a family through disruption because of a single moment. And he looked at the liaison the way boys look at men, hoping for sympathy. But the liaison's face remained professionally neutral, and when the boy's eyes flickered toward Rosalia, she lowered her gaze and folded her hands to keep them from shaking. When the door closed behind the officials, the house fell into the kind of hush that trembles before it shatters, and Rosalia knew the second wave would come not from the city, but from her own blood, and it arrived, fast and hot, as her daughter turned on her with that careful smile extinguished, her voice sharp, accusing, asking how dare you, asking what did you tell them, asking whether she understood that she had just jeopardized everything they had worked for. And Rosalia, who had spent decades apologizing for breaths she had not yet taken, found that her mouth refused to shape the word sorry, and instead she stood as straight as her joints permitted and said that she had told the truth, a sentence that seemed to reverberate, strangely, because truth had long been unwelcome here. The boy sneered and said that no one would believe an old woman over them, that recordings could be edited, that neighbors minded their own business, that everyone knew old people made things up when they wanted attention. And as he spoke, he paced, not unlike a caged thing, and he knocked his knuckles against the doorframe as if testing its strength, and his mother told him to go upstairs, which he did, shoulders stiff, the thud of his steps counting out a brutal metronome to the argument that followed. What came next was not a physical explosion, but a campaign of pressure, a suffocating fog of small retaliations that tried to make Rosalia regret the call more than she had ever regretted her silence. The thermostat turned lower, so nights bit even. Through blankets, the grocery list pared down with the bland rationale of budget constraints until her meals shrank to things that required almost no energy to consume. Because they offered almost no energy in return, the mail intercepted before she could see it. The keys to the front door moved from their hook and never returned. A litany of tiny disempowerments that would, if collected in the abstract, sound like petty grievances, but, in the marrow of a life, operate like a siege. Each evening, the daughter would try on new stories in front of Rosalia, rehearsing the revised family history she planned to share with whomever asked at the next visit, saying how concerned she had been for months about her mother's memory, how she had pleaded with her to rest, how she had shushed the boy when he was disrespectful, and each script ended with a sigh heavy enough to suggest a martyrdom that she fully expected to be admired. Rosalia endured these performances in silence, though sometimes, lying awake in the deep figure of night, she allowed herself to imagine the specialist's pen scratching calmly across a form, the liaison's quiet nod, the gradual stacking of facts into something too solid to be swept away by the broom of charm. It was during one such night that she heard a faint scratching outside her window, and for a moment fear turned her blood cold. But then a whisper threaded through the glass, a woman's voice, tentative but kind, saying her name and asking if she was awake. And when Rosalia inched the window open, she found her neighbour standing there in a quilted coat, a worried crease between her brows, saying she was sorry to startle her, but that she had seen the official city car earlier and guessed at the reason, and that if Rosalia needed anything, even just a witness to say that not everything had been as cheerful as the daughter made it seem, she would come forward. She would tell the truth about the times she had heard shouting and the days she had seen the older woman shuffling to the pharmacy alone in slippers, with a prescription that, judging by dates, should have been refilled long before. The kindness in that offer nearly undid Rosalia, who had been living in a contracted world where mercy seemed extinct, and she found herself gripping the windowsill and promising herself that, before the week ended, she would share the neighbour's name with the specialist, that she would add this strand of testament to the rope she was braiding out of the raw fibres of her life. In the days that followed, the first escalation thickened like weather moving in from the horizon, slow enough to prepare for and yet unstoppable once it arrived. The school called to confirm an appointment with the liaison, and Rosalia overheard her grandson rehearsing his performance in the bathroom, adjusting the mirrors of his face to show contrition when necessary and indignation when useful, practicing the phrase "I didn't mean it" until it sounded unconvincing even to his own ears. And beneath the practice there was a child who was afraid of consequences, but more afraid of illumination, because if the officials could see him clearly, they might see, too, the currents he swam in at home, the permissions he had absorbed, the way contempt had been taught to him as a dialect of love. The specialist phoned to schedule a second home visit and asked politely whether Rosalia would be comfortable meeting briefly at the clinic where her primary care records were housed. And Rosalia agreed, and then hung up the phone and sank into the chair by the window, because she understood that the next time those badges crossed her threshold, the story would not belong solely to the loudest voices anymore. On the morning of that second visit, the house was scrubbed to a sparkle that did not match what it smelled like when strangers were not expected. The daughter's hair shone like a dark blade, and the boy wore a clean sweatshirt in a colour he had previously declared boring, and each of these choices was an attempt to control what the eye believed. But as the door opened and the officials stepped in with the same calm they had brought the first time, Rosalia felt the edges of the performance starting to fray, because on the hallway table the glossy brochure for assisted living was gone. But a faint square of dustless wood declared exactly where it had sat, and on the kitchen counter the number for the pharmacy was written on a sticky note, as if accidentally left in a place where it could be noticed and then explained. And in the living room, a list of household chores had been posted in tidy handwriting that featured the boy's name 3 times more than ever before, which was evidence by overcompensation that pointed back to absence. The specialist greeted everyone and asked that they begin with a short walk-through of the home, not to inspect cleanliness, but to observe invisible architecture. And as they moved from room to room, she asked small questions that were actually large. Like who keeps the keys? Who picks up prescriptions? How are utilities managed? Who decides when the thermostat turns and when it doesn't? And each time the daughter answered quickly, too quickly. And each time the liaison jotted a brief note and asked Rosalia to confirm with a nod or a slow blink, and she did. And the house itself seemed to shift under the weight of documentation. When they finally sat, the specialist set a small recorder on the coffee table and asked permission to record, not because she doubted her memory, but because the department had learned, after many years and many contested hearings, that the human voice bears witness in ways that paper and pen cannot. And the daughter agreed with a flourish of hospitality, and the boy nodded, and Rosalia, with relief that felt like a soft crack inside her chest, said, "Yes, let the machine capture what has happened here." The specialist pressed the button and asked a simple question, the kind that opens doors or reveals barricades. "Tell me about a day in this home, from morning to evening, as it actually is, and not as you wish it to be," the daughter began, but the boy interrupted, then stopped himself, and in that hesitation, Rosalia saw the shape of what might be possible now that the truth had been invited to sit among them as a recorded guest. And when it was her turn, she spoke, steadily, not as a supplicant, but as a witness to the life she had lived, and the room, for the first time in years, felt arranged around her voice. By the time the second week rolled into the house like a damp wind that never quite dried, the rhythms of inspection and denial had become a kind of duet that Rosalia could hear even when no one was speaking. A tense counterpoint between officials who brought calm voices and clipboards, and a daughter who seemed to keep a bouquet of expressions ready for every moment, all bright petals and hidden thorns. And into this choreography there came an invitation that felt as dangerous as it was necessary. A suggested meeting at the clinic where Rosalia's medical records were kept. Not because the department doubted her story, the specialist explained, but because the cadence of protection had to be written in more than one hand if it was to hold under pressure. And Rosalia, who knew the pressure would be unrelenting once the family realized that charm was not enough, agreed and dressed very carefully the morning of the appointment, buttoning a cardigan whose elbows had been darned twice, and whose softness gave her the illusion of armor, then sat in the waiting room between a coughing child and an old man reading the same paragraph for 10 minutes, while the clock on the wall measured out a patience that she had taught herself with decades of practice. When the nurse called her name, she glanced once at the specialist who had arrived ahead of her, and now rose with a nod, and together they passed through doors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper, into an exam room with a chair too high for comfort and a blood pressure cuff that squeezed a little harder than it needed to. And then the doctor, who had treated her for years, stepped in and greeted her with kindness that seemed thinner than she remembered, as if gentleness had been reduced to a tone rather than a conviction, and he asked careful questions about medication adherence and appetite and sleep, his eyes slipping to the screen where alerts pulsed in red, reminders of refills missed and appointments cancelled or rescheduled. And for a breath, Rosalia felt accused by a machine before she had even spoken. But then she reached into her bag and produced the paper from the pharmacy that showed dates and quantities and the sharp downward slope of care when the refills had stopped. And she said, without theatrics and without apology, that bottles had been kept from her on the grounds of expense, while shoes and headphones and deliveries she did not order had arrived at the house as if someone had pressed a button for everything except her needs. And she watched the doctor's shoulders shift very slightly, as if a knot had moved one finger's breadth toward loosening. And when the specialist asked if the chart could be annotated to reflect a concern of neglect, the doctor hesitated in the way people do when their names must be attached to truths that might call them into rooms they would rather not occupy. But after a long minute, he did type a line that said, "The patient reports barriers to medication access within household," and he printed a copy of the updated summary and handed it to Rosalia as if it were both a receipt and a promise. And though the ink was still wet when she folded it into her bag, it felt substantial in a way that words rarely had. Inside her home, that afternoon, the house enlarged its performance as if it had studied stagecraft overnight. The counters wiped twice. A vase of supermarket flowers decanted into a heavier glass pitcher to make them look more expensive than they were. The boy, wearing a shirt with a collar for no reason except the fact of witnesses, and Rosalia could taste the artificial sweetness of it all, as if the air itself had been dosed with something meant to sedate common sense. And while her daughter narrated chores and schoolwork and bedtime routines for the liaison who had come to do a walkthrough without announcing it, Rosalia stood in the doorway to the kitchen and let her eyes travel toward the drawer that had been relabeled household papers in a benevolent hand, the same drawer where once her bank statements had been tucked, and where now she suspected a new choreography of concealment lived. And as the liaison asked the boy what time he did homework and who set the rules about screens, the boy looked quickly at his mother, received a nod that was almost imperceptible, and said he was trying his best, which sounded possibly true and yet not quite complete. And Rosalia felt a deep sorrow for him that was not a forgiveness, but an understanding, because children were apprentices to whatever theatre they were raised in, and there was a kind of poverty in learning how to lie as easily as you learned arithmetic. When the liaison, polite as always, asked if the family would object to him speaking with a neighbour or two, the daughter's laugh landed a shade too loud, then softened quickly, and she said with a small wave of her hand that people loved to invent drama, that one should not always trust ears pressed to the wall, and the liaison nodded and said he would never rely on hearsay without corroboration. Then asked a very small question that unlatched a very large door. He asked who kept the keys to the house in case of emergencies. And he watched, very carefully, the split second in which both mother and son looked toward the same hook on the wall where no keys currently hung. And he made a note that could have been about nothing or everything, depending on which page it ended up on later. The midpoint, when it arrived, did not announce itself with fanfare. It slipped into place the way cold slips into old bones, a convergence of threats and proof that made Rosalia's mouth dry and her resolve steadier than it had ever been. And it began with a knock at dusk from two people who were not from child services, but from a community crisis response unit arranged by the daughter under the pretext of concern. A tall woman with kind eyes and a man carrying a tablet who spoke softly about evaluating safety, their voices warm and careful, their presence heavy with possibility, and Rosalia understood what was being attempted, a maneuver that would mark her as confused and unstable enough to merit removal if she made the wrong move. And standing under the low hallway light, she felt the breath leave her and then return in a slower rhythm, because she also understood that this was the narrow bridge she had to cross without slipping. They asked if she had been eating regularly, and she answered that she had eaten what was given. They asked if she ever got lost in her own neighbourhood, and she said she had lived on this block longer than the maple across the street had stood tall. They asked about forgetfulness, and she said that misplacing a comb was not the same as misplacing a lifetime. And at each answer, the daughter hovered a respectful distance away, like a shadow that would insist on being helpful if invited. And at last, the man glanced toward the specialist's card that Rosalia had set deliberately on the table, the card with a name and a direct line, and he asked whether it would be all right to call to coordinate support rather than escalate into something more. Intense that evening, and the daughter's smile thinned but held, and Rosalia nodded, and a call was made. And when the specialist's voice arrived over the speaker in that even tone Rosalia now associated with the first feeling of breathable air, the crisis team thanked everyone and said that no immediate action was necessary, that a follow-up would be more appropriate, that sometimes the best intervention was time plus verification. And once the door had closed, once the daughter's face tipped briefly into a snarl before righting itself, Rosalia gripped the back of the chair until her knuckles cooled, because she had felt for a minute the suction of a fate that many before her had not escaped. After that evening, the acts of pressure turned from petty to strategic, the thermostat games replaced by a new economy of isolation, calls from the specialist knocked out of sequence because the phone had died, mail that should have arrived on Tuesday, showing up on Friday, opened and refolded. Neighbours who waved in the morning receiving radiant smiles from the daughter later that afternoon, accompanied by remarks about how age was cruel to memory, and each of these moves was another thread, in a cloak that she hoped to throw over Rosalia when the next official stood in the doorway. But Rosalia had begun to stitch her own garment out of harder cloth, and on the following day she walked slowly, one hand on the railing, down the back steps, and across the narrow strip of yard to the fence where the neighbour had once whispered her name through the glass. And she said, with a voice that did not tremble, that officials might come to ask questions, and that while she did not want to trouble anyone, truth was a neighbour's duty when harm was in question. And the neighbour, who wore a knitted hat and the kind of face that carried other people's discomforts like groceries, said she would tell what she had heard and seen, would even give the date she had driven Rosalia to the urgent care last winter because a cough had sounded like more than a cough, and the daughter had insisted that clinics were for people with time to waste. And Rosalia felt a gratitude so specific it burned, because it was one thing to speak of bruises on the spirit, and another to have someone else point to the same mark and say, "Yes, there it is. I saw it too." Later, when the specialist called and Rosalia passed along the neighbour's name, the voice on the line grew a shade more solid, and the next steps were outlined with a clarity that turned worry into work. A sworn statement to be taken during a scheduled office hour, releases already signed to be used with purpose, a list of transactions from the bank to be requested properly rather than plundered from a drawer when no one was watching, and a plan to speak with the school counsellor, because children sometimes told truths in a different register than adults, and the register mattered when a judge later weighed credibility like stones in a hand. In the middle of this, which already felt quite like a storm that could reverse direction with a shift of wind, there came the call that threatened to undo the careful weave. A voice from a law office with an address downtown where the daughter could never have afforded a consultation on her own, saying that they represented a family member concerned about Rosalia's capacity to manage her affairs and requesting, with an oily politeness that made Rosalia's skin prickle, that she make herself available for an evaluation of competency, and Rosalia, who might once have agreed out of reflex and fear that refusing meant guilt, said calmly that any such evaluation would need to be coordinated through the agency already involved, and that she would not meet privately with anyone her daughter paid to sit in judgment before facts had been gathered. And she hung up the phone and leaned her forehead against the cool window pane until the buzzing in her fingers quieted. And that night she did a small, brave thing that looked like nothing from the street. She took the folder of bank statements from her drawer, the doctor's printout with the note about barriers to medication, the pharmacy slip, the neighbour's name written in careful block, letters, and she tucked them into the bottom of a canvas grocery bag, so ordinary it would not attract attention, and she slid the bag under her bed like a child hiding treasure, and she slept for the first time in weeks without waking at every whisper of the house. On the day designated for her sworn statement, the office where the specialist met her was warmer than she expected, a room with a window that looked onto a tree that had mismatched leaves, as if 2 seasons had struck a private bargain there. And the affidavit, when it was read back to her, made her want to weep, not because it hurt to hear, but because it did not flinch. It did not pretend that cruelty had been an accident. It did not soften language to make anyone more comfortable. And when she signed, her name curved across the page the way it had when she was young, and wrote it on applications for jobs she hoped would last longer than the season. And the specialist stamped and scanned and placed copies in envelopes and in a file and in a digital vault. And for a long breath, Rosalia imagined those syllables of her name now living in places her daughter could not unlock. And she walked back to the bus stop, with her bag light and her chest full of both fear and a kind of peace that felt like a temporary ceasefire. That evening, predictably and almost on schedule, her daughter exploded in the kitchen at the sight of the empty vase, asking where the flowers had gone, and then, without waiting for an answer, accusing Rosalia of manipulating the officials with theatrical stories, insisting that the neighbour had always wanted to be part of other people's business, threatening to change the locks in a way that made Rosalia's blood run cold, until she remembered that lock changing without proper notice and cause was not simply unkind, but illegal, and she said so, not with triumph, but with simple information, and the boy, watching from the doorway, blinked as if the furniture had shifted slightly, and he had not noticed until this moment that gravity could tilt in more than one direction. The midpoint ended the way thresholds end, with one foot on the old floor and one on the new, and in the wrinkle between them, a small event occurred that no one would mark on a calendar, and yet which defined the path forward with more authority than any printed notice could have done, because an email arrived at the specialist's inbox while Rosalia sat across from her, sent by the liaison who had just left the school counselor's office, an email that said, in restrained language that nonetheless trembled, that the boy had admitted to using words he knew were cruel, and to taking part in jokes at his grandmother's expense that he understood now were not jokes at all, that he had, when asked whether the thermostat games existed, looked at his shoes so long the counsellor had changed the question and then returned to it later, at which point he nodded without speaking, and that the counsellor, asked to write a brief summary of concern, had agreed, not because she had taken sides, but because the child's own mouth had placed him on a side whether he realized it or not. And when the specialist turned her screen so Rosalia could read the lines herself, the older woman felt the strange pain of relief, which was a sensation she had not known could exist, and it carried with it not triumph, but a deeper resolve. The knowledge that the story would be measured now against more than charm and more than habit. That for all the traps laid in the living room and the phone calls made at dusk, there was, in the quiet architecture of systems designed to be slow, precisely because slowness protects the vulnerable, a way through. And so she walked home with the afternoon light falling in strips across the sidewalk, like the pages of a book being turned by an invisible hand. And when she opened the door and saw the daughter's face, she understood that the fight would sharpen before it softened. But something fundamental had shifted at last. Something that could not be set back by a tantrum or a bouquet or a lawyer's letter. And that was the midpoint. The hinge where a life begins to move on its new axis, not with a shout, but with the steady torque of proof, breath, and the refusal to disappear. The shift from fragile hope to raw despair came suddenly, as it often does when institutions meant to protect become twisted by the influence of those who know how to manipulate them. Rosalia had spent days gathering evidence, building the fragile scaffolding of trust with the specialist and the neighbour, and even the counsellor, who had coaxed out fragments of honesty from her grandson. It seemed, for a brief and precious stretch of hours, that the tide was finally turning. Yet one late afternoon, the knock at the door was not from a social worker or an ally, but from two officers carrying a writ that described her not as a woman seeking safety, but as a subject of inquiry into her own mental competence. The words blurred before her eyes as they explained, with polite detachment, that a petition had been filed by her daughter alleging confusion, erratic behaviour, and paranoia, and that a preliminary hearing would be held to determine whether a guardian should be appointed to oversee her affairs. The injustice of it struck like a blow to the chest, not only because of the betrayal, but because of the terrifying familiarity of the tactic. She had feared this exact maneuver from the beginning, the quiet legal coup that would twist her resistance into proof of instability. Her daughter hovered in the background as the officers spoke, her face arranged in an expression of deep concern, a performance polished to perfection. She nodded at each phrase, occasionally interjecting that her mother often forgot names, misplaced documents, and became confused about dates. The boy kept his eyes lowered, but when pressed by one officer, he muttered that yes, sometimes his grandmother acted strangely, though he refused to elaborate. Each small hesitation, each carefully rehearsed line, became another brick in the wall being built around Rosalia, a wall designed to contain her, until her voice could no longer reach beyond it. She wanted to scream, to play the recordings at full volume right there in the hall, but the officers were not there to adjudicate truth. They were there to deliver process. And process, cold and blind, demanded that she comply, that she appear at the hearing, that she defend herself against the charge of being unfit to defend herself. The days that followed were heavy with dread. Letters arrived stamped with official seals, each line reminding her of what she stood to lose. Not only her home and her savings, but the dignity of deciding even the smallest details of her life. The daughter spoke loudly into the phone about consultations with attorneys, her voice carrying the smug certainty of someone who believed the machinery of law would grind down any resistance. At night, Rosalia could hear her grandson whispering with friends online, his laughter sharp and careless, mocking her as if she were already defeated. Even the neighbours, who had begun to show signs of support, grew cautious, reluctant to entangle themselves too deeply in a dispute now framed as a question of mental health. Sympathy curdled into silence, and silence was precisely the soil in which injustice thrived. On the morning of the preliminary session, she dressed carefully, pulling out the navy skirt she had kept folded for years and pairing it with a white blouse whose collar she pressed flat with trembling fingers. She wanted to look composed, rational, credible, even though every nerve in her body screamed that appearances were nothing compared to the venom of lies. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, a blend that reminded her of hospitals and waiting rooms, places where people surrendered control to strangers in uniforms. When her name was called, she walked into the chamber and found her daughter seated confidently beside a lawyer in a tailored suit, a man who nodded courteously to the judge while shuffling a stack of affidavits. He spoke first, weaving a narrative of decline and confusion, citing missed bill payments, misplaced keys, and supposed episodes of wandering outside at night. Each example was delivered with calm authority, each one a distortion of reality, yet convincing enough to create doubt. When her turn came, Rosalia spoke slowly, her voice steady but weighted with emotion. She explained the recordings, the withheld medication, the threats and insults, the deliberate campaign to erase her. She presented the paper from the doctor, noting barriers to treatment, the pharmacy slip, the neighbour's account. For a moment, she saw the judge's expression soften, a flicker of recognition that this was not the incoherent rambling of a confused elder, but the testimony of a woman fighting for survival. Yet just as quickly, the daughter's attorney objected, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial, that the neighbour was biased, that the supposed recordings were unauthenticated and possibly fabricated. The judge allowed the objection into the record, and though no final ruling was made that day, Rosalia felt the balance tilt away from her, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted toward a cliff edge. By the time she returned home, the atmosphere in the house had transformed into open hostility. The daughter no longer bothered with false smiles. She moved through rooms with the sharp clatter of someone who believed ownership was imminent. The boy muttered insults under his breath, louder now, emboldened by the sight of his grandmother faltering. Even the meals became stages for humiliation, her plate set with smaller portions, her requests for tea ignored. And though Rosalia tried to steady herself with the knowledge that the fight was not yet lost, she could feel the injustice pressing in on every side, an invisible cage closing tighter. That week became the darkest stretch of her life. Nights were filled with whispered prayers and restless pacing, days with the exhausting effort of proving her own sanity to people who had no interest in truth. Each time she touched the folder hidden beneath her bed, she felt both hope and terror. hope that it might one day be enough, terror that it might vanish, stolen or dismissed. She began to understand that survival required more than patience, more than evidence, more than faith in institutions. It required allies, visible and undeniable, voices that could cut through the smog of lies. And though the unjust turn threatened to crush her, somewhere beneath the fear, a deeper determination began to form, a vow that she would not be erased, that this betrayal would not be the final word. The week after the hearing request moved like a slow fever through the house, and if the unjust turn had been the moment when the ground tilted beneath Rosalia's feet, this was the stretch when the world seemed determined to push her the rest of the way over the edge, because every day brought a new pressure fashioned to look like concern, a new kindness that cut like a knife, a new bureaucratic letter that pretended to ask while in fact demanding. And in that suffocating accumulation, the daughter's strategy sharpened from rumour to action, beginning with the bank where, under colour of protective oversight, a clerk informed Rosalia that unusual holds had been placed pending verification of her capacity, a hold that would be lifted soon if appropriate paperwork came through, which translated to nothing less than a temporary seizure of a lifetime's work until the same people who were erasing her decided they had erased enough, and she left the branch with the taste of metal in her mouth, fingers clenched around the small balance slip that now read like a riddle. Because what was hers could be visible and yet unreachable. A number on paper, but not a loaf of bread in her kitchen. At home, the daughter carried herself like a landlord at inspection, and that new posture seeped into everything, from the way the thermostat was guarded to the way the keys disappeared during the day for safekeeping, from the way deliveries addressed to Rosalia were intercepted and opened just in case, to the way the grandson's friends were invited over for loud evenings that doubled as reputational warfare, a chorus of easy jokes about how Grandma is getting forgetful again, and Grandma asked the same thing twice, and Grandma cried because the kettle whistled, all said with a performative fondness that turned ridicule into a scene of affectionate pity. And though Rosalia wanted to shout that she was not a prop in anyone's farce, she understood that the fight had left the small border of her kitchen and now lived on terrain where evidence and timing were everything. And so she said little and watched everything, because watching had become her new form of work, and it turned out she was very good at it. Child services, which had started this journey because of the boy, now looped in adult protective services after the clinic note and the neighbour's name reached the specialist's desk. And the specialist, who was careful with words and therefore trustworthy, called Rosalia to explain that overlapping jurisdictions were not a delay but a ladder, each rung necessary to climb in order for any rescue to stand in court without toppling at the first gust of doubt. And on that call, Rosalia learned to say the phrases that mattered, phrases like financial exploitation and pattern of coercive control, phrases that did not romanticize what was happening but pinned it like a specimen. And learning those phrases gave her back a piece of her breath, because naming was a kind of ownership, even when the thing named was a wound. The liaison followed with a note that the school counsellor had committed her observation to paper. Not a novel, not a denunciation, just a quiet paragraph that described a boy who knew he had said things he should not have said and had lived in a house where contempt was a routine. And the power of that paragraph was not its drama, but its ordinariness, because ordinary cruelty, when written down, is harder to explain away as an exception. The second escalation came into full view on a Tuesday morning when two strangers in tidy polo shirts with the logo of a private memory care facility appeared at the door with a smile that belonged to salespeople, not clinicians, carrying a brochure that showed laughing elders beneath trees and a packet of forms pre-filled with Rosalia's name. And in that instant, the mask slipped. The daughter had scheduled an evaluation tour without Rosalia's consent and had told the facility that urgency was required because Mum is a danger to herself. And the men, gentle but firm, used words like safety, transition, and peace of mind. And their tone was so soothing, it was almost hypnotic. But Rosalia, who had been a little girl, poor enough to know the scent of manipulation long before the world invented euphemisms for it, asked them whether their assessment could be conducted only after an agency-led evaluation already in progress, and whether they were aware that a court date was pending, in which their paper would likely be waved like a flag. And the men glanced at each other in a brief, naked moment of uncertainty, then thanked her and retreated with the brochure, leaving behind the echo of a transaction that had not quite closed. And when the door shut, the daughter lost her composure and hissed that Rosalia would go if she said so, and Rosalia answered, very calmly, that a facility which admits a person by force must do so through legal steps, and legal steps involved judges, who tended not to enjoy being used as moving companies, and the boy, standing on the stairs, pretended to check his phone because he did not know where to put his eyes in a room where his mother had not won. That afternoon, the neighbour with the quilted hat came by with thermoses of soup, and, without fanfare, a small thumb drive she did not explain. And Rosalia did not ask. She simply slid the drive into the lining of her cardigan, and later, when the daughter was at the store and the boy was in the shower with music too loud, she checked the contents on her old phone with a borrowed adapter, and what she saw made her hands shake in a way that was not fear, but the relief of proof. The neighbours. Small camera, set to watch her own yard after a break-in last spring, had by accident captured sound through the chain link and fragments of sight through gaps in the fence on multiple evenings, including the night the boy had shouted about nothingness, including the morning the daughter had bragged about refinancing once the old situation was solved, including a moment where the thermostat argument rose to an absurd pitch and ended with someone unplugging the space heater from Rosalia's room while saying she had lived long enough to be used to the cold. And however imperfect the footage, however partial the frames, the audio tracks were undeniable in timbre and language. And Rosalia sat down on the bed and let herself cry, because the world had given her an accidental witness that did not fear being accused of bias. She called the specialist and explained that new material existed, and the specialist told her how to deliver it securely, where to drop it off so it would be logged and preserved. And for the first time since the petition had landed like a stone, Rosalia felt the gears turn in a direction she recognized as forward. The daughter, sensing the shift without understanding its cause, invited a cousin and an aunt for the weekend, and staged what looked like a supportive family circle and felt like a tribunal, a round of speeches about gratitude and compromise and how elders sometimes forget that care is a two-way street. And when Rosalia did not take the bait, the aunt turned tearful and spoke of the tragedy of seeing a family torn apart by stubbornness, and the cousin, who owed the daughter money, declared that courts were only for those who refused to solve things in-house, and Rosalia, who could hear the shape of a trap long before the cage door swung, said quietly that in-house had been attempted for years, and now the house itself was evidence, and, in that sentence, the air shifted, because the daughter realized that this time her adversary would not be argued into a corner, but would bring walls and windows and thermostats into the transcript. And there was a brief silence into which the boy said he needed to study and fled to his room, because even the young have limits for how much doublethink can be sustained at a single table. The second escalation also grew teeth in places Rosalia could not see. In emails exchanged between the specialist and an APS investigator who had the patient habit of people who do more by moving slowly than others do by sprinting, in quiet calls to the bank manager who had known Rosalia for years and kept copies of forms showing who had added their names to what and when, in a request to the pharmacy for a line-by-line record that did not lie about gaps in the liaison's visit to the school, where a teacher, unnamed and careful, spoke of days when the boy's temper was short in ways that suggested something was snarled inside him at home. And all of this crawled toward a shape large enough to be seen by a judge whose calendar was crowded, and whose patience was limited, but whose eye, when handed a stack of facts neatly tabbed, tended to linger on the tabs. Meanwhile, in the house, the daughter staged a midnight drama by calling the non-emergency police line and reporting that her mother had threatened her with a kitchen knife, a lie so bold Rosalia could feel it before she heard it. And when officers arrived, polite and alert, they encountered an old woman in a cardigan sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of tea and a crossword, while a daughter pointed to a knife block with the trembling hand of a victim. And the officers did exactly what training coached them to do: separate, ask soft questions, look for mismatch between words and rooms. And soon enough, one of them found the small thumbprint of soup on the alleged knife from dinner 2 hours earlier and asked, almost idly, whether Rosalia was right or left-handed, and whether she had any cuts on her hands, and whether there were any cameras in the house. And when the daughter realized this line of inquiry would not end with a simple removal, she pivoted to tears and tremor, which bought her sympathy, but not what she had hoped to purchase. And the officers left with a report that included the word unfounded. And in a quiet corner of the precinct, an APS flag was attached to the call log because patterns are made from repetition, not theatrics. On Thursday, the specialist phoned with a voice that held both caution and a small uplift, telling Rosalia that an interim motion had been filed to preserve the status quo of her finances until the hearing could be held, that no new withdrawals or changes could be made by anyone but her without triggering a notice to the court. And although this was not a victory, it was a tourniquet. It stopped the bleeding enough for oxygen to return, and Rosalia said thank you, and then sat alone for a long time, letting the silence of an unplundered account feel like a kind of music, because in a house where sound acquired the weight of claws, quiet could be the most radical sound of all. That same day, the neighbor recorded her statement before a notary arranged by the agency, her hands steady, her details calm, non-judgmental, exact. And when Rosalia read the copy later that evening, she was struck by how ordinary truth looks on paper, compared to the violence it withstands in life. And she slept a little, then woke, then slept again, a stuttering but real surrender to rest. The daughter responded to each setback with new inventiveness, spinning a tale for relatives about an ungrateful mother poisoned by outsiders, whispering to the boy that everything was collapsing because of a betrayal he could fix if he remembered correctly in his next interview, emailing the facility again to book a second tour under the claim that her mother had finally stabilized enough to see reason, and even leaving a church pamphlet by Rosalia's door with passages highlighted about honoring parents, a grotesque inversion of scripture meant to shame the injured into silence, and Rosalia, who had been ashamed of too many things that did not belong to her, folded the pamphlet into the same drawer that held the bank slips and the clinic note, not because it was evidence of law, but because it was evidence of method, and method mattered. On Friday evening, as if to test exactly how much heat the house could bear without bursting, The daughter invited neighbours for coffee under the pretence of a reconciliation circle, then spent the gathering remarking, with a devastated half-smile, that her mother had accused her of theft and planned to drag their family through the mud of court, to which most guests replied with sympathetic noises and a sprinkling of suggestions about mediation, and Rosalia, when the specialist's number flashed on her phone from the bedroom where she had retreated, whispered that the theatre was in full dress rehearsal, and the specialist, who had heard many such finales, said that performances tend to climax just before the curtain drops. In the thick of all this, a letter arrived from legal aid, a small envelope harbouring an enormous relief, stating that pro bono counsel had been assigned to Rosalia for the hearing, an attorney whose caseload was heavy, but whose spine did not bend in whines like these. And on the first call, the attorney spoke in the brisk, respectful language of those who trust their clients, asking for a timeline, asking for names, asking for copies, promising nothing except that the record would be made, and the law would be asked to look straight at it. And when the call ended, Rosalia sat with the phone in her lap and realized that even if the house remained hostile, the larger house, the city, the state, the dull machinery that sometimes grinds the right, grain, had admitted her as a resident rather than a trespasser. The attorney requested the clinic note, the pharmacy log, the school summary, the neighbour's affidavit, the audio and the fence footage, the bank manager's willingness to confirm dates of added names and removed names. And as Rosalia gathered those pieces, she realized she was assembling not only a file, but a mirror in which her daughter would finally be forced to meet herself without the fog of charm. The second escalation closed the way storms sometimes do. With a stillness so sudden it felt like an ambush. A quiet Saturday morning when no one shouted and no door slammed, and even the kettle seemed to whisper instead of sing. And in that calm, Rosalia prepared for the week ahead, like someone polishing a blade they hoped never to use, setting out her clothes for court, labelling copies, writing a brief list of points to steady her voice if it trembled. And she caught her reflection, and did not look away, seeing not a victim but a witness who had remained in the room when others tried to dim the light. And in that recognition, she felt something like the earliest edge of courage, the kind that does not need to roar because it has survived being muted. The daughter's footsteps paused at the threshold of Rosalia's door, then moved on without entering, and the boy's door remained shut, and the house breathed evenly for the first time in months, which did not mean peace had come, only that the war was, resting its muscles before the next round. And Rosalia, glancing at the canvas bag under her bed as one touches a saint's medal, understood that the next round would not be fought in whispers, but in a room where voices are recorded and faces are forgotten until transcripts summon them back. And that was enough to carry her into the dawn of the day when she would stand, not small, not nothing, and call the thing by its hardest, truest name. The day of the hearing dawned grey and sharp, the kind of winter morning when the sky seemed made of iron and the air cut like a blade. Rosalia rose before dawn, moving slowly but deliberately, dressing in the same navy skirt and white blouse she had worn for the first session, pressing the fabric until it looked like armour, brushing her hair back from her face, slipping the folder of documents and the small thumb drive into her canvas bag. Every motion carried the weight of weeks of humiliation and the fragile hope of justice. And when she caught her reflection, she almost did not recognize the woman staring back, her eyes no longer dulled by fear, but lit by something harder. The ride to the courthouse felt endless. The hum of the bus and the chatter of strangers, a distant noise compared to the drumbeat of her own heart. She clutched the bag to her chest, whispering under her breath words she had repeated like a prayer. They cannot erase me. They cannot erase me. The courtroom was crowded, not with an audience of strangers, but with the presence of family tension so thick it seemed to fill the benches. Her daughter sat at the petitioner's table beside her attorney, both of them radiating confidence. The daughter's hair smooth, her suit sharp, her lips curled in a performance of concerned duty. The grandson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to the floor whenever they landed on his grandmother. A few neighbours had come, the quilted hat woman among them, seated stiffly, her hands folded tightly as if to keep from trembling. The specialist from Child Services was present as well, flanked by the APS investigator, both holding binders that looked heavy enough to anchor a ship. At the respondents' table, Rosalia sat with her legal aid attorney, a young woman whose brisk words and straight posture carried more strength than any ornament, and together they formed a strange but undeniable team, one seasoned by a lifetime of endurance, the other by the discipline of law. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. He was an older man, with the weary expression of someone who had seen too many lies, too many manipulations, and too many families shred themselves in the name of protection. The daughter's attorney rose first, his voice smooth as polished wood, weaving a story of decline, confusion, and paranoia, speaking of misplaced keys and missed bills, of supposed threats with knives, of an elderly woman fabricating accusations. Because she could not accept the passage of time, he painted a portrait not of cruelty, but of concern, not of exploitation, but of care misunderstood. And for long minutes the narrative hung in the air like smoke, curling into the corners of the judge's perception. Then Rosalia's attorney stood, her voice measured but carrying steel. She presented the clinic note, the pharmacy log, the neighbour's affidavit, each document carefully placed before the judge like stepping stones across a river of doubt. She spoke of the boy's counsellor, of patterns of coercion and financial manipulation, of a house where the thermostat became a weapon and medication was rationed as punishment. Rosalia sat silent beside her, her hands folded tightly, her chest rising and falling with each word, until her attorney asked permission for the court to hear additional material. From her canvas bag, she withdrew the thumb drive, its plastic casing ordinary, almost shabby. Yet inside it lived the sound of cruelty unguarded. The judge leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes, and after a brief exchange with the clerk, the drive was inserted, the speakers adjusted, and the room filled with the voices that had haunted Rosalia's nights. The grandson's shout cracked through the courtroom. "You're nothing to us!" followed by his mother's dismissive laughter, then her cold voice speaking of refinancing once the old situation was solved. The audio was grainy, punctuated by the rustle of wind through the fence, but the venom in the words was undeniable. The room seemed to freeze, every cough silenced, every shifting foot stilled, as the raw contempt echoed against the wood-panelled walls. Rosalia's daughter flushed, then paled, then straightened in her seat, as if posture could undo what sound had already carved into the record. The climax swelled further when the neighbour was called. She rose, her hands steady despite the tightness around her mouth, and she testified to what she had seen and heard through her window, to the nights when shouting spilled into her yard, to the mornings when she saw Rosalia walking stiffly, her sweater too thin for the frost, her face lined with something deeper than age. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, each word carrying the weight of a witness who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by standing against neighbours. The attorney for the daughter tried to shake her, pointing out that fences distort sound, that distance creates error. But the woman did not bend. "I know what contempt sounds like," she said simply, and the judge nodded once, almost imperceptibly. As if the evidence itself were not enough, the grandson was called to the stand, and though his mother squeezed his hand tightly before he rose, he could not sustain the performance. His eyes darted, his voice faltered, and when asked directly whether he had ever shouted that his grandmother was nothing, he whispered yes, barely audible. But the microphone caught it, carrying the admission across the courtroom like a toll-linked bell. He stammered excuses, words fed by his mother, but the damage was done. And in that moment, Rosalia felt both heartbreak and vindication. Heartbreak that the boy she had once rocked to sleep had been used as a weapon against her. Vindication that truth, however reluctant, had found its way into the open. The daughter erupted then, her voice sharp and trembling with rage, declaring that the recordings were fabrications, that the neighbor was jealous, that her son was confused, that her mother was manipulating everyone in the room. The attorney tried to calm her, but the fury could not be contained, spilling into threats, into a declaration that all of this would mean nothing once guardianship was granted. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder, restoring order, but the mask had slipped entirely. The court had not only heard the contempt, but had seen it, raw and unvarnished. And Rosalia knew the climax had crested, the family's performance unravelling before the one audience that mattered. When her turn came to speak, she rose slowly, every joint aching but her voice steady. She did not deliver a speech rehearsed or polished. She simply told the truth. She spoke of cold nights without heat, of medication withheld, of a grandson taught to despise his own blood, of a daughter who had turned care into control and love into currency. Her voice cracked once, but she lifted it again, louder this time, saying that she was not nothing, that she was a woman who had worked, who had saved, who had given, and who would not be erased. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise, and even the judge did not speak immediately, as if giving space for the words to settle like stones at the bottom of a river. In that stillness, Rosalia felt a shift, a realization that the climax was not only about evidence or testimony, but about presence, about standing in the room where they had tried to declare her invisible, and being seen, undeniably, unforgettably. And though the ruling had not yet been spoken, though the paperwork still had to be signed, she felt the scales tilt, the balance of power move, the first breath of justice stir the air. The daughter sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. The grandson slumped in his chair. The attorney shuffled his notes with the uneasy movements of a man who knew the tide had turned. As the session adjourned for the day, Rosalia gathered her folder and her bag, her fingers brushing the worn fabric as if it were a talisman, and she walked out of the courtroom not with triumph, but with the unshakable knowledge that the fight was no longer fought in whispers, but in the full light of law. The climax had not ended the war, but it had broken the silence, and in that rupture there was strength. The ruling came on a clear, brittle morning that smelled faintly of snow and disinfectant. The judge's voice even and careful as he moved through the pages in front of him. A cadence so measured that for a moment Rosalia thought her body might split from the pressure of waiting. And then the words arrived with the weight of something irrefutable. The petition for guardianship was denied for lack of credible evidence. The financial holds were to be lifted immediately. A temporary protective order would bar any interference with her person or accounts, and the court strongly recommended that Adult Protective Services continue its oversight while civil remedies were pursued for suspected exploitation and neglect, at which point the daughter's attorney shifted in his shoes and looked down at his legal pad as if it had betrayed him, and the daughter pressed her lips together so tightly the colour drained from them, while the grandson stared at a point somewhere on the floor, that could not. The judge did not grandstand. He simply pointed to the record, to the audio that no one could unhear, to the neighbor's statement and the school summary and the clinic note and the pharmacy log, to the police report marked unfounded after the knife. Call to the bank forms demonstrating an attempted quiet rearrangement of ownership, to the pattern that would not be dismissed as coincidence. And he said, in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding, that dignity is not an indulgence, and the law does not exist to facilitate the erasure of those who raised us. Outside the courtroom, the winter light was thin but honest, and Rosalia stood on the steps with her legal aid attorney and the specialist and the APS investigator and the neighbour in the quilted hat who had taken unpaid hours to sit through a hearing that was not hers and yet in a larger way belonged to all of them. And for the first time in months, the older woman allowed herself the small animal act of breathing deeply without calculating what might be taken from that breath. There were logistics to settle and papers to collect and phone calls to make, banks to notify with the stamped order, the pharmacy to call to resume refills on schedule, the utility account to reclaim with a clean password, the post office to place a hold until a locked box could be arranged, the locksmith to schedule within the letter of the protective order so that no one could claim she had acted in secret. And each of those mundane tasks felt like a sacrament because they stitched the edge of her life back onto itself. The attorney spoke briskly of next steps, a civil action to seek restitution of funds siphoned from her pension and savings, a narrow, targeted police referral on the financial piece rather than a scattershot complaint, because precision has more bite than volume, and Rosalia nodded, not because she craved vengeance, but because accountability is a kind of medicine that tastes bitter and heals slowly and is still worth taking. Returning to the house was not a victory march, but an exercise in control, the kind that begins with a folded paper in a handbag and ends with a door opening to a space in which someone once told you that your presence was a problem. And her hand shook as she slid the key into the lock for what she understood would be the last time in this configuration of her life. She had chosen, after the ruling and after a long talk with APS, to leave the house rather than wait for the daughter to be compelled to behave inside it, because safety can be a new set of walls and not a reclaimed old one, and a small apartment in a senior building 2 bus lines away had appeared as if conjured by years of thrift. Modest rent, sunlight that found the sill by 8 in the morning, a wide hallway where she could set a narrow table with a glass bowl for keys that belonged to no one but her. Still, she walked the rooms she had helped pay for, touched the back of the chair where she had once been told not to sit, emptied the drawer that had held her folder, and took down from the hook the cardigan she wore on the hardest days. The daughter was not there. The protective order had been served at the courthouse, and APS had arranged a supervised retrieval window for anything that remained hers, so that tempers had no chance to pretend to be storms. The grandson's door was closed, and she did not open it, because forgiveness is not the same as curiosity, and neither is a requirement for leaving. She carried her canvas bag and 1 suitcase down the steps, with the neighbour waiting in the foyer, and the locksmith arriving just as she reached the bottom. And when she reached the sidewalk, she did not look back. Not because she feared what she would see, but because the sight would add nothing to what the papers already said. The first night in the new apartment surprised her with its quiet, the kind of silence that is not emptiness, but a soft platform on which the mind can put its feet down without slipping. And she moved through the small rooms with a deliberate care, setting the kettle on the stove, placing the pill organizer by the sink, pinning the doctor's refill schedule to the corkboard on the wall, sliding the thumb drive into a tin she labelled with the date, arranging the folder of legal documents in a drawer she locked with a small key she wore on a string around her neck. She turned the thermostat to a number that felt like a small rebellion and did not ask anyone's permission, and she took her medication with a glass of water and tea afterward, and did not ration either. And when the radiator clicked and hummed, she smiled at a noise that had so often been a harbinger of debate, and now was simply a machine doing its job. Later, when the neighbour knocked softly and came in with 2 bowls and too many napkins and a jar of pickled beets she insisted were good for winter blood, they sat at the little table and spoke of practical things, how to order groceries by phone if the bus was tiresome, which home health aid agencies had women with steady hands and decent humour, what church basement hosted the free tax clinic every February. And in that inventory, Rosalia recognized a map back to ordinary life, not glamorous or cinematic, but precise and stitched with the names of people who show up when no camera is pointed at them. Weeks unspooled like thread from a spool someone else had been holding too tightly for too long. And in that measured release, Rosalia learned again the rhythm of mornings that begin with her own breathing rather than someone else's mood, of afternoons with a book that did not need to be hidden when footsteps approached, of evenings punctuated by a phone call from the attorney or the specialist, or the APS investigator who addressed her as Miss Stoyanova and meant it as respect, not distance. The civil case crept forward at the speed of systems that resist speed on principle. Subpoenas sliding across counters in banks where managers remembered her by name, a forensic accountant assigned by legal aid lifting the lid on transfers that had tried to hide as routine, a mediated session scheduled and then cancelled when the daughter's counsel realized that good faith would require admissions they were not ready to make, a second session scheduled and attended because leverage changes, appetites at which a repayment plan emerged that would never truly compensate for the years shaved off Rosalia's peace, but would mark, in ledger lines and automatic debits, the fact that harm is not a fog. It is a number, too. The protective order remained in place, renewed once without drama, and then allowed to lapse, because by then there was nothing left to protect, except a boundary that had calcified into common knowledge. And even the grandson, through the school counsellor, asked to send a letter, which arrived on a Tuesday, folded into itself and full of phrases learned from adults. I take responsibility. I am sorry for my words. I want to do better. That nevertheless carried a tremulous music of something true inside them, and she placed the letter in the tin with the thumb drive, not as evidence, but as a record that people can learn even when they have been taught cruelty. On a late afternoon in early spring, sunlight collected like honey along the windowsill where she had set 3 geraniums bought from a church fundraiser, and she trimmed dead leaves with patient fingers while the radio murmured the weather. And she realized she had gone an entire day without thinking about court or forms or locks, and the realization did not make her feel disloyal to the woman who had fought those battles. It made her feel contiguous with her, as if the line from the first, recorded insult to the warm cup in her hand had never snapped. That evening, the kettle sang, and the phone buzzed with a message from the specialist saying that the APS case would close next month, with a note that the client had secured safe housing, restored medical access, legal counsel, and protective measures. Sufficient to mitigate risk, and the bureaucratic language made her laugh softly, because it was the stiffest possible way to say a simple thing. You are safe now, at least for this season, and if something sways, call. We will adjust the scaffolding. She sent back a thank you that felt too small and still adequate, then placed the phone by the window, where the light turned it into a small polished stone, and she stood there long enough to watch the street lamps yawn awake, one by one. There were still ripples, because life does not flatten itself out on command. A day when a letter arrived with her daughter's handwriting and she tucked it, unopened, into a drawer for another time. A morning when the bank called to confirm a routine security flag and the sound of a verification question made her throat tighten. An evening when the bus driver braked too hard and she felt, for a breath, the old fear of falling, but each ripple receded into the larger pool of days that were hers to spend, and with each receding she felt less like a woman who had survived a storm and more like a woman who had moved to different weather and learned where to hang her coat. She began attending a Tuesday group at the library where women with careful hair and battered wallets discussed scams and signatures and how to say no without apology. And sometimes she spoke, and sometimes she only listened. And each time she left, with a flyer in her purse and a new name in her phone. And once, walking home under a sky the colour of clean linen, she realised that the feeling in her chest was not simply the absence of terror. It was the presence of room. On the day she finally set the old phone on the table and scrolled through the files she had once guarded like a life raft, she listened to the recordings one last time, not to punish herself or to relive anything, but to confirm that the voice that whispered, "You are not nothing," had been telling the truth all along. And when the last file ended, she copied the folder to a labelled drive and placed the original back in the tin, then shut the lid gently and slid it into the drawer. And she brewed tea and called the neighbour to ask if she wanted to share a slice of cake. And when the doorbell rang, she opened it without flinching at the sound, and the apartment filled with the ordinary sweetness of two women eating something simple at a small table, while the radiator ticked and the geraniums leaned toward the light. The world had not changed in any flashy way. No parade would ever march for what she had done. No newspaper would print the quiet arithmetic of her victory. But the furnace of her life burned at a temperature she set. The cups in the cupboard faced forward. The pills in their compartments had dates that matched the calendar. The keys in the bowl were keys to a place where no one would ever again tell her that warmth was wasteful. And that was a resolution not written in the rhetoric of triumph, but in the grammar of days, which is where dignity lives when it is allowed to move back in.